What you see before you are two Nintendo GameCubes, but something doesn't seem right about one of them. This one here is quite a bit smaller than your run-of-the-mill GameCube, but don't let its size fool you. Inside, this thing sports authentic Nintendo hardware, custom PCBs, all enclosed in a perfectly scaled replica shell. This is the GC Nano, and it's the smallest real GameCube in the world. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito, and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today, we'll be taking a look at an incredible project that shrinks the GameCube down by over 90% of its original size. And even more incredible is that it doesn't rely on emulation or a Raspberry Pi-like device, but rather utilizes authentic Nintendo hardware. This is the GC Nano, an impossibly small GameCube developed by Wesk and CrazyGadget. Now, looking at the GC Nano itself, it's honestly hard to convey just how small it is. So, for some perspective, here it is next to a regular GameCube, a Game Boy Advance SP, and a banana. Yeah, it's pretty dang small. At the heart of the GameCube Nano is actually a Nintendo Wii. The Wii, as we all know, is backwards compatible with GameCube games, but perhaps more crucially, it lends itself quite well to miniaturization, which is obviously crucial for a project like this. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the person behind the GC Nano is someone that I've previously featured on the channel. Wesk, who you may remember from my Ultra Slim PS2 mod video, actually presented the idea of a micro-sized GameCube to the BitBuild community as a sort of challenge to see if there was anyone crazy enough to take on the project. And to his surprise, he got a response. CrazyGadget, another modding enthusiast, took up the challenge. Wesk would work on the overall project design, while CrazyGadget was in charge of PCB design and test builds. Now, it may not come as a surprise, but projects to shrink the GameCube is something that we've actually seen before. But Wesk and CrazyGadget would break the barrier of what was previously thought possible. Taking inspiration from Madmorta's incredible GameCube Classic build, which is currently the smallest GameCube on record, Wesk and CrazyGadget would further reduce the size by 16%, making it the new, smallest GameCube in the world with a footprint no larger than that of a regular Game Boy cartridge. So in order to achieve that further reduction in size, the donor Wii motherboard would need to be trimmed down to its bare essentials so that it can fit inside such a small housing. In the BitBuild modding community, there are several tiers of trimming that can be done to the Wii motherboard. We have the OMG WTF, the LMAO, and the Omega trim, which is the smallest and most challenging of the three. The Omega trim is what enables the GC Nano to be so small, and it's the Wii's unique PCB layout that allows it to be trimmed to such a small size. Additionally, RV Loader, which is a software specifically designed for Wii portables like the GC Nano, is extremely important to the build as it patches out hardware requirements that a stock Wii requires to even boot. The GC Nano project is the culmination of years of hard work and is nothing short of amazing. So let's dive right in. Alright, so in this video, I'll be going over all the parts of the GC Nano that make this project possible. Then I'll do a brief assembly to show you how it all comes together, go over all of its unique features, review the pros and cons, and of course provide you with my overall thoughts. So I have to start by giving a huge shout out to CrazyGadget for sending over all the parts necessary to build the GC Nano. These are mostly pre-assembled and ready to be put together. For greater detail on these parts and the project as a whole, definitely check out Wesk's post on the BitBuild forum, which I'll have linked down below. Anyway, the first item I want to talk about is the shell, which is what really brings character to this build and sort of sets the stage for the entire project. It has incredible details, such as the Nano logo on top, the extremely accurate side vents, a fully functioning rear handle very much like its larger sibling, and even small memory cards that you can attach. The attention to detail is really quite remarkable. Now, in addition to the custom shell, CrazyGadget designed several custom PCBs which are needed to allow the GC Nano to function, which actually brings me to today's sponsor, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a mod like the GC Nano, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, such as the glass-like transparent resin that Wesk used in his ultra-slim PS2 build, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course, PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order. And again, a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Alright, so the first custom PCB I want to show you is the top board. This not only has the power and reset button, but also contains the USB-C port for powering the system, a micro SD card to hold all the necessary files and games, as well as this chip here, which allows you to actually transfer files to the micro SD card through the USB-C connector. This is really awesome because the SD card isn't really accessible when the Nano is all put together, making this a really convenient feature. Additionally, CrazyGadget designed the board to enable any power delivery compliant charger to output 5 volts at 3 amps, such as this tiny Anker power supply. Next up, we have the controller board. This is what interfaces the Nano to the original GameCube controllers via these TRRS headphone jacks. It's a really ingenious design, and I think it's just so cool that we're able to use real GameCube controllers on the Nano. The controllers are connected to the headphone jacks using these custom adapters. CrazyGadget also incorporated these pull-up resistors for the data lines, since the original resistor array was removed due to the Omega trim on the Wii motherboard. Okay, now let's move on to the power supply board. It features a set of 5 buck regulators to provide all the necessary voltages to the Wii motherboard, as well as 5 volts for peripherals. Again, a very compact design. And while the Wii isn't a very power-hungry device, it does need to be actively cooled, so we have this tiny fan to keep air flowing through the system. And lastly, here you can see the Wii motherboard with the Omega trim. Again, this is the most extreme of all the trims, and just as a visual, here's a photo comparison of an untrimmed Wii motherboard against an Omega. It's absolutely insane. And because the trim is so extreme, the NAND needs to be reintegrated onto the board since it lies outside of the trim. This is done with a NAND relocation flex, which is made by the folks over at 4Layer Tech. Here you can see where the NAND is reattached on this fully built out Omega trim. Additionally, to get video out of the Nano, Wesk and CrazyGadget utilizes the AVE HDMI mod from Electron Shepherd. This HDMI kit is perfectly suited for the Nano in that it's incredibly small and compact and allows for the removal of the AVE, which is inherent again in the Omega trim. And here you can see a fully built up Omega trim which has the NAND relocation, AVE HDMI mod, heatsink, and wires already attached and ready to go. And with that, let me give you a quick overview of how the GC Nano is all put together. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is that this is really just a top-level overview of how the Nano is put together. Like I mentioned earlier on, all the custom PCBs as well as the trimmed Wii board have been pre-assembled by CrazyGadget. For a more detailed set of instructions, definitely check out Wesk's post on the BitBuild forum, which I'll have linked in the video description below. Anyway, the first thing I'm showcasing here is the top board being installed into the housing. Once it's in, I grabbed the 4 headphone jacks and press fitted them into the controller port openings. It's a pretty tight fit, so I used my pliers to help out. These connectors all have to go in a specific orientation in order to work properly. Next, I went ahead and dropped in the controller board, which fits like a glove, and goes to show just how well both Wesk and CrazyGadget collaborated on the design. And here's the controller board all soldered in. There are 3 connections that need to be made to the top board, so I went ahead and wired it all up. Next, I began pre-wiring the power supply before we install it into the Nano housing. This board that I have here is a prototype, which is why I'm soldering directly to some capacitors. The final version will have dedicated pads for all the connections, so you won't have to do this. Once all the wiring is complete, I went ahead and dropped it in along with the fan. It took a bit of finessing, but it did go in fairly easily. Now, one thing that I did need to do here was expose some of the ground plane on the trimmed Wii motherboard so that I can solder one of the ground wires from the PSU. I did this simply using my craft knife until I had enough material exposed. Then I went ahead and dropped in the Omega trimmed board, ensuring that all the power supply wires weren't getting pinched in the process. Then I began to solder in all the requisite wires from the PSU to the Wii motherboard. Once completed, it should look a little something like this. Next, I began to solder in all the other wires to the top board as well as the controller board. Here you can see the data lines which connect the Wii motherboard to the micro SD card slot. Once the top and controller boards are all wired in, it should look something like this. And here you can see I used the FFC to connect the AVE HDMI kit to the full-size HDMI port. The HDMI port is then mounted to the Nano's handle with 2 screws. Once those are fastened, the handle slides into the Nano's housing, which actually holds it pretty firmly in place. And here's a look inside before we button it all up. But before we do that, I went ahead and inserted my micro SD card with all the necessary files. When closing the Nano, make sure all the wires are clear of the edges and don't get pinched in between the top and bottom. The Nano closes up really nicely and cleanly, and all that's left to do is secure the top and bottom half by fastening the 2 screws on either side of the handle. And there you have it. The world's smallest GameCube. I honestly have to say that the GC Nano is a really incredible project. I know I say that a lot on the channel, but what people are doing in the modding community is nothing short of amazing. And that definitely applies here to the work that Wesk and CrazyGadget did on the GC Nano. Anyway, let's do a quick rundown of all the key features that the GC Nano has to offer. First and foremost, the most obvious feature is its size. It's crazy that we basically have a fully functioning GameCube that fits in the palm of your hand. On top of that, it outputs crisp video using Electron Shepherd's AVE HDMI kit, which utilizes iCorb's GC Video Digital AV Converter, which is the same GC Video standard that's found on devices like the Carby. Of course, it has 4-player support via the 4 TRRS headphone jacks around front. But unfortunately, this particular unit did not support my Wavebird controller, as it did not have the MX chip installed due to the Omega trim. This is something that currently requires relocation on every Wii trim for proper Wavebird, Virtual Console, and real-time clock compatibility. I do, however, have it on good authority that most of these issues will be patched in an upcoming version of RV Loader without the need for the MX chip relocation. Now that'll be really cool. Anyway, around the top of the console, there are of course both the power and reset buttons, both of which perform as expected. However, there is a third button, which on the original console is for opening the CD compartment. However, again in my particular unit, this button is non-functional. In the future, this button will activate Bluetooth pairing. Bluetooth relocation is only used for syncing Wiimotes and is in general considered optional, as RV Loader has a feature called GC to Wiimote, which allows you to map Wiimote controls to the GC controller to play a vast array of Wii games that never supported the original GameCube controller. Speaking of which, you can also play Wii games on the unit. While it's primarily intended to play GameCube games, I still think it's pretty cool that Wii games also run on the console. So I guess, does this make this technically the smallest Wii in the world too? Anyway, the last feature I want to highlight I think is also one of the most interesting. This USB port around back not only powers the console, but it also allows you to transfer files directly to the SD card inside. This is fantastic because once you put the Nano together, you really don't want to take it apart every time you want to access the SD card. This really makes using the GC Nano extremely convenient, and I really like that this feature was integrated into the console. Also, the mere fact that you can run the console on a power brick the size of an iPhone charger is also really neat. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. The GC Nano is basically a fully functioning GameCube that's smaller than a Game Boy Advance. Incredible stuff. Okay, so now that we took a tour of the device, let's go over the pros and cons. Starting with the pros, I have to say that this is just a really cool project. Folks like Wesk, CrazyGadget, Red Herring 32 and many more are always pushing the limits of what is possible. So if you're thinking that the GC Nano is just a small GameCube and nothing more, then I really think you're missing the point. The amount of work that goes into projects like this, especially when you have such polished results, really show the incredible dedication that these folks are putting into their craft. And the GC Nano is no exception. As far as the cons are concerned, there really aren't any. Of course, this is an extremely difficult project if you ever wanted to undertake it yourself. Trimming the Wii motherboard, coupled with building each individual custom PCB, as well as the advanced soldering and fabrication work required to pull this off, is no small feat. However, for those brave enough to take on this challenging build, Wesk and CrazyGadget have made this project completely open sourced, with all the documentation, files, instructions, all available on their BitBuilt post, which again I'll have linked down below. Also, be sure to follow Wesk and CrazyGadget on the BitBuilt forum and their social media, as I'm sure we'll be seeing some very interesting updates to the GC Nano in the near future. So, there you have it. The GC Nano project from Wesk and CrazyGadget. The smallest real GameCube in the world. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again next Thursday.